Hi everyone, I'm Sam Gilson.
And I'm Sarah Cottrill, and today we're going to talk about connections between a poem called The Goblin Market and Lord of the Rings.
In 1862, Christina Rossetti wrote a poem called The Goblin Market. This poem involves two sisters, Laura and Lizzie. And the gist of it is that when Laura and Lizzie are collecting water at a stream, Laura becomes tempted by spooky goblins calling her to buy fruit from them. Laura succumbs and eats the fruit, even though Lizzie warns her against it. As a result, Laura falls deathly ill, so Lizzie seeks out the goblins in hopes of curing her sister. Despite being attacked by the goblins, Lizzie is ultimately successful in curing Laura of her affliction. And around 100 years later, the series Lord of the Rings was created. And you may not think the two are related, but you're wrong! You're so unbelievably wrong. The two are actually very similar in their themes.
So most people have seen The Lord of the Rings, but for those who haven't, the general idea is that Frodo gets the Ring of Power. And if the evil Lord Sauron has the Ring of Power, then he can take over the world with it. So Frodo and a group of friends go to take the Ring of Power to the only place it can be destroyed, Mount Doom. And like 2,000 pages of stuff happens in between then and there, and then it gets destroyed. So happy ending. Yay.
Just out of those descriptions right there, you can probably start to make some small connections between the stories. But, you know, if you're a little slower and you can't, we can redirect your mind into thinking about the main themes that connect these two. That being
temptation is at the heart of both stories. And in The Goblin Market, Laura gives into the temptation of eating the goblin's fruit, which kind of makes her miserable and crazy.
And in Lord of the Rings, the main struggle is Frodo's attempt to resist the temptation to put on the ring and use Sauron's power.
And let's not forget that both characters were warned of the risks of falling to temptation.
Yeah, in the Goblin Market, Laura is actually warned about Jeannie's fall and how Jeannie ate the fruit. She thought of Jeannie in her grave, who should have been a bride, but who for joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died in her gay prime.
And in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo was told about Isildur's chance of destroying the Ring of Power, but he didn't.
So, Sarah, are you trying to tell me that both characters ignored the warnings?
What's interesting, though, is that while both Frodo and Laura gave into temptation, like Isildur and Jeannie did, they were ultimately saved by Sam and Lizzie. Lizzie desperately tries to prevent Laura from taking the forbidden fruit, but Laura does. Lizzie ends up going to the goblins, sacrificing herself, and getting attacked in order to free Laura from the goblin spell.
And then, in Lord of the Rings, Sam, much like Lizzie, desperately encourages Frodo to resist the temptation of putting on the ring. But when the burden becomes too much for Frodo to bear, Sam literally throws him over his shoulder and carries him to his journey's conclusion.
Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!
But Frodo still fails and puts on the ring several times throughout the story and ultimately chooses to keep the ring at the crack of Mount Doom, just like Isildur. Ultimately, it was up to Sam to save Frodo's life, just like Lizzie saves Laura.
So, Sam and Lizzie are the ultimate saviors of the story, and Frodo and Laura would not have survived without them. But why does this matter? Literature has got to have a point here, right?
Overcoming temptation is really, really hard alone. Even outside of novels, a lot of people struggle with addiction to things like gambling, drugs, sex, procrastination, and they use what they call accountability partners to keep them accountable and overcoming their temptation.
And in today's society, filled with electronic communication, woven, many are even finding accountability and friendship in the internet, where they can share anonymously and help others with any struggle you can think of.
This does beg the question, though. What happens when your friends aren't enough, or maybe, you don't have any friends, and you fall into temptation?
Precious!
Yeah, that happens.
Getting back to our stories, in both tales, characters who give into temptation often undergo some pretty terrible transformations. For instance, in Goblin Market, Laura goes from a beautiful young lady with flowing golden locks to a ruined woman with thin gray hair.
And then you have the goblins, the bad guys of the story. They're pretty ugly with all their animalistic features.
Oh yeah, doesn't Lord of the Rings have a lot of ugly bad guys too?
Yep, but many of these characters didn't just become evil and ugly because they were intrinsically evil. This isn't some silly, nerdy comic book. Rather, many of them became that way because they fell into temptation. Usually the temptation of power from the corrupting influence of Sauron. Let's take a look at the results. characters in Lord of the Rings end up giving in to the temptation of Sauron, and when they do, they either become one of three things: ugly, old, or very dead.
Much like in Goblin Market, where characters who give in to the temptation of the forbidden fruit also end up ugly, old, and sometimes dead.
As you can see, temptation plays a big role in both of these stories. Both the main characters, Frodo and Laura, fall into some horrible, self-destructive temptation, and it's up to their faithful friends, Lizzie and Sam, to save them. And when they fail, it's just a little bit ugly in both stories.
So remember everyone, next time you're struggling with temptation, get help! Otherwise, you might just end up holed up in your room with the precious!
Thank you for watching, everybody, and have a nice day.